Thank you, everyone, for being here. Personally, just thank you for C, thank you for your team at Blue Sky. Like, this is my first ever solo show. It brought tears to my eyes to see it all come together in Portland. That has become my home over the last 5-7 years. PAM was the first museum to collect my work. I have deep love for this city and for its community, so it's emotional even speaking about it, so I'm just extremely grateful for this opportunity. But jumping into this body of work, so this is called Tha Crossroads, spelled T-H-A, which is in reference to the Bone Thugs-n-Harmony song, which came out the same year I was born, which I didn't realize until, I'll get to that in a bit, but I guess the best way to start with this is to really talk about like my family lineage and kind of what led me to making this work. So the kind of story or the aura around who my mother is she ran a kind of a Hindu, it was part of the Hare Krishnas of the 70s and 80s. She ran an ashram in rural America for 30-some years. And one of the stories of hers, she was exactly my age when she was in a bookstore and she found the book of her guru, Haidakhan Babaji. And she was just like, I meant to do this. And she went from being a school teacher to transitioning her whole life into following the kind of words and the teachings of Babaji. Ultimately, that led her to his ashram in the foothills of the Himalayas in India, where she met my father. And together they kind of, she just continues teachings until his passing in, I believe, '86. And so then she moved back to the United States. She started this ashram in Wahoo, Nebraska. Well, actually, it's a town outside of Wahoo. It's Malmo, Nebraska, 40 people. And outside of Malmo, Nebraska, it was near 10 miles on a dirt road, was her ashram. Anyways, so her guru passed in '86, and around 2000, she started receiving emails from the deceased guru. And it kind of split up the whole community of Hare Krishnas in the United States. A lot of them were just like, oh, this is, she's a charlatan trying to cheat people out of money for the 501c3. And other people were like, no, like Babaji in these emails are saying direct things that only he would know. And I remember when I was, well, I barely remember this, but I do remember. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, my mother brought me to the ashram in India, where she studied with this guru. And I had one of those toy Polaroid cameras, the kinds that you used to, back in the early 2000s, where you pull the film out. It was like a slide that they gave to like kids. It was still a Polaroid brand camera. And I was just taking pictures of all the nature of being in this like beautiful setting as like a young black kid in like India. And I took a picture of the tree that Babaji used to sit under. And I didn't know this, but it was the tree that like everyone knew was his like prayer spot. And as the photos developed, I ran 108 steps up to where my mother was, and I showed her the Polaroid I was just finishing to develop. And there was a figure of unmistakably Babaji sitting under that tree. And it's one of those things I didn't really think about until, my mother's passing just in the last 2 years. She was passed in 2023. But I was going through her archive and going through her writings and going through her stories and being like, and remembering this story. And I'm like, oh, well, here I am using Polaroids to photograph this spirit that wasn't necessarily visible at the time of me knowing it, in the same lineage of what my mother was doing when she received those emails. So fast forward, I grew up in this farm on this ashram in rural Nebraska, and I, for the whole entirety of the story, I was adopted by this white family in rural Nebraska. And so I was very much disconnected from like my black lineage and my black spirituality that I knew was missing growing up, but I didn't necessarily have the language for. And so I started just kind of photographing the environment of this Nebraska prairie land, which I grew up in. And there's a lot of areas, especially around my mother's farm, that was like actual prairie land. And I just remember photographing these like dreamy like nightscapes of this land, of this property. And certain symbols would start to appear as the moon would start to create squiggles, or certain shapes of flashing light would start to appear, or certain like movements or gestures of my hands would start to appear. And I didn't necessarily have language for what those meant, but I knew that they had some type of meaning to me. So fast forward, I turn 18 and I'm like, I'm getting the hell out of Nebraska. I gotta find my people, I gotta find my culture, I gotta find something that like invigorates me. And I moved to, straight from a kid growing up in Nebraska to Oakland, California. I started attending San Francisco Art Institute, and I was just like, how can I be a part of it all? I ended up being taken in by some protesters and activists who, they ended up becoming my adoptive family. One of them was one of the earlier founders of BLM, and they just saw this kid who had this like deep, like spiritual connection, like this weird family lineage. And they're like, oh, you're good at documentary photography. What's this? We're going to take you to all these protests. We're going to take you to be a part of all these happenings. And one of my greatest mentors, his name was, he's still alive, was Sam al-Badri. He's a great photographer. He's doing work right now. This has to show up, anyways. He inspired me a lot because he stuck around when Black Death happened. One of his famous photo series is documenting Mario Woods' mother. And Mario Woods was a young Black man who was killed by, Latino man who was killed by SFPD in 2015. And, as happens when Black Death happens, it becomes a spectacle. News reporters come in, they document, they photograph the crying mother, and then they leave. And my friend, he kept returning back to Mario Woods' mother. He kept returning and telling the story, and now he has a friendship, 6-7 years later with the family. And it's like, oh, to have this kind of conversation with death also requires a level of care, and that's something that I was early informed by this mentor. So, I'm in undergrad, and I have this professor. His name is Dewey Crumpler, and he's a, early jazz cat. He was friends with Sun Ra back in the day. He's from like Bay Area based. He was, a great muralist and painter. He's still around doing these great pieces. And he taught this class on just African art and spiritualism. And he put me onto this text called Flashes of Spirit. And I'll jump to that in a second, but before he showed me that, he was looking at these images I took in rural Nebraska, and he's just like, oh, you're photographing Oshun right there, right? Like, you're photographing this spirit, you're photographing this spirit, and he could name me all these spirits that I was directly referencing with these shapes and these lines and these gestures, and he's just like, maybe this is something that's attuned to us, it's something that's within you, and you just have to be able to, even though you didn't have the language, it's something that's in your blood. And so I started seeing photography as this means to be able to tap into this kind of ancestral line, this ancestral rhythm, I'll even say, that I didn't necessarily know I had at the time. So he put me onto this photo book called Flashes of Spirit, and in it, this anthropologist, white dude, but amazing, amazing writer. He was one of the first people to write about African art in the West and say it's not primitive, which is like a beautiful, bare minimum, but we love him for it. He said this thing along the lines of, in West Africa, there would be these white shining masks, or there would be these masks that are used for spiritual communion, that as the light would hit it, it would create this kind of light flashing or this sparking light effect, right? And his belief, or not his belief, he would document and people wrote about and would teach him as he's partaking in these ceremonies, was that as the light flashes, that was quite literally spirit possessing the person, coming in and like, in the same way, if anyone's familiar with like hoodoo, when someone's possessed or catches the Lawal mounts the rider, or if you're in the Kojic church, when someone catches the Holy Spirit, it's the same energy, but light was this kind of, love you, bunny. Light was this kind of technology in a sense, or this like ancestral technology to be able to be used as an act of divination. And so I started creating this series, and so the first ever image from that series is the image that's on this altar, which is called Leave You My Dream, which is the final words of Osho. If anyone knows Osho, he was a spiritual practitioner, teacher, had his kind of a cult in rural Oregon, actually. But my mom was one of his disciples in a sense, and when Osho passed, a lot of his followers actually went and studied under my mom at her ashram. But so that the first piece that ever came of that, Leave You My Dream, and ultimately that led to that black and white piece on the left of those two called Flashes of Spirit, in reference to that text. And so I started covering myself in this sequin material and creating these self-portraits or these series to be able to make myself like a direct connection, I would say, to spirit itself. How can I not even be present, but how can I make a direct passageway from my ancestors and my spirits to guide my movements, to be able to inform me what lessons they had to give? So that's what led me to these works. And then I started noticing that these flashes of light started happening throughout my practice in general. I'd always use this throne light, again, as this technology to kind of open a portal, this heavy flash at night. Fast forward a little bit from there, 2020. And again, oh wow, I'm just actually putting this together. It was again Dewey Crumpler in a conversation with Sadea Hartman. He said this beautiful line, something along the lines of like, in the West, people see blackness as emptiness. They see it as devoid of anything being there. But in the African context, the void is always written as a space of ultimate potentiality. It's always written as a space for spirit to exist, but for anything to possibly happen. And I always thought that was such a beautiful, like, ways we can kind of replace this like black hole, you know? And so I started re-going through my archive. Now this is 2020. I'm sitting after all of the craziness going on in our lives. And I was finally sitting with the photos I had for the last 10 years. And I was just like, well, the two things that are always present in this work are these kind of voids that we see, like, you know, in the dark blacks of my images, or in the solarization process, or in the solarization of Polaroids, or mixed with these kind of strobes of light. And one of the effects that I started noticing most, especially as I continued to use Polaroids, was this moment that happened of these kind of cross lights, or these cross stars that happen in these photos, which is very specific to the kind of, you know, Polaroid film I use. And I'll tell the quick story of this image because it's one of the most, I think this is the image that really solarized the practice of Tha Crossroads for me. This is one of my best friends back home in Nebraska, and I created this portrait of him on my birthday actually in 2019, April 20th. And he was, sorry, it gets me emotional thinking about, but he's just a great leader, a great activist, a great person who kind of led during those 2020 protests. He's the one that kind of informed my political practice, my political ideology, and he taught me this phrase of just like, my hatred is rooted in love. He would say that, you know, the violence that we do or we enact upon the state is actually this ultimate act of love for this future to come. And fast forward to 2024, he was violently murdered by, honestly, just a white racist man, and back home in Lincoln, Nebraska. And this image ended up becoming the kind of eulogy image that was used throughout Nebraska and throughout his home country in Africa. It ended up just becoming the image that we all use to kind of understand Kupo, in a sense. And behind him ended up being the same star of the flash of light, which is spirit becoming present in an image guided by a black hole, which is the space for potentiality. And so I started to understand death as this means of kind of this death as a space for potential as well as something dark. So in the image of the gun, you know, it goes to this deep blacks in the left side of the frame, and that was purposely done to say, like, we don't need to show the full gun to show the potential that lies at the end of it. And also, you know, used by this black woman's hand that's firing this weapon, it's also to be seen as a space for potential for it to be happen, and that, you know, which I wish I could show you the film is what I'm doing for my thesis. My thesis is all video and film works about violence, so it's a space for like potential energy. But in it is to say, like, it's again met with these crosses of light to say, like, violence is actually a way that we need to kind of honor. So I'll come back to kind of the naming of the project itself. So the Crossroads is something that black people reference throughout our culture, throughout our lineage. Like, we always go to the crossroads to kind of give an offering to an ancestor to be able to, you know, give us guidance, to give us our talents, to give us our force, to give us our power. And one of the crossroads I'm referencing most, and throughout the book that I'm about to publish of this work, it's guided by 4 chapters and made around, so I'm kind of going all over the place. It's around, okay. It's around the Congo cosmogram. And so the Congo cosmogram is kind of it's a symbol that we see honestly throughout all of West Africa, but it's one of the few symbols that actually survived the Middle Passage. We actually have seen this symbol in the bottom of cabins that held enslaved people in the South. Like, it's one of those few symbols that, like, how could people necessarily remember it? It's maybe something that was an ancestral technology or an ancestral symbol that we had within our blood that we just always described. And so in it is a cross and a circle and sometimes pointing arrows that kind of lead you counterclockwise. And in the, I'm gonna go like this. No, I won't count. I'll use this as a reference to Congo Cosmogram as a circle. The top would be where physical power is. It's like when the sun is the highest point of the day. It's where, peak powers maybe towards like when you're, 20s or 30s. It's in the middle of your life when you have this energy. And then the sun starts to set in the west. And as one dies, as one transitions, and there'd be a cross line, and then you're into the land of spirit as the nighttime, in the sense that you're following the sun. And then you would come back in the east as birth. And so this whole space itself is actually guided off of the Congo Cosmogram. So if we're facing east right now, which we are, this image is called Birth of the Purple Moon. And so this is based off the Sun Ra Ta song of this similar title, Night of the Purple Moon, where I'm actually layering two Polaroids on top of each other and burning holes throughout it. And so fire is another thing. There's only one image in here, I believe, that uses fire as a means to get there, but throughout the book I use fire pretty often as a means to burn images. But I see fire as this space of clarification, as a way to cleanse. And so I use fire in this image to be able to clear this hole so I can see my partner's eyeshadow. We can like move into this space of potential force. We have to use destruction to kind of get there. So this image is called Birth of the Purple Moon, and it exists again with this formation of the crossroads by my partner. Well, as we move over to see if that's east, this would be the north wall, is the space of the physical world. This is where Kupo lands because he's the one who informed my physical actions, my physical practice. He's the one who kind of gave me the praxis to actually do activist work. And we're met with the gun, which is the symbol as we use as this it's the tool to get a revolution started in a sense. We move over to the west wall, and that's the space of death. That's the space of decline. That's the space of transition. The, beat up sneakers on a cross line can be a symbol for passage of mourning, as a symbol to those who've been lost. This is this figure is meant to be as a woman of transition that helps us, guide us through the process of death as a space of mourning. She looks to the left, she looks to the east. And then that's the crossroads. That's the image from the crossroad in front of the family home that I grew up in rural Nebraska. We move to the south, and now we're in towards the land of spirit. I'll start with the image of Mami Wata on the right, and just to kind of give some of the backstories to some of these images. Mami Wata is kind of one of the original stories of the mermaid tale. So if we know of in the West, we always think of mermaids as this beautiful woman that guides these sailors into the water and then kills them. And it's this Christian story of don't follow your temptations, don't follow your joy, don't follow your pleasure. But in the African context, Mami Wata is this figure that leads these sailors into the water. And when they go to quite literally a crossroads. They go to the spiritual plane, and then they return. They always return in the story of Mami Wata. And when they return, they come with a sense of they return with clear eyes, it seems. They have a sense of aesthetic sensibilities that they never had before. They have a sense of clarity, of coolness that they never had before. And it's to say that, I want to understand this circle of life and death not through the kind of, not as a negative thing, but the kind of Christian connotations I was raised around in the Midwest, but as a space of potentiality and respecting this kind of recycle that I understand through my now found African spiritualism. And so that's kind of resequenced through a lot of these images that are kind of referential to this space of where we go to honor spirit or images that exist as spiritual beings. And then we return back into this space of becoming, as birth. I have a few more notes, but I honestly would like to just kind of end it there, and I'd love to just kind of open to questions and conversations, and may speak on some singular images, but just answer whatever people may want to know. So thank you.
Of course.
So, in the work, it's like you're
mixing these sort of like ethereal, like dreamy photographs with some photographs that are like very, like in reality, like the road back there, and even like the hands, like it's very like photographic in the more traditional sense of the photography. And I'm wondering, like, what if there's sort of a reason that you're doing kind of both, and like what you think that brings to the work.
I think that both are just kind of coexisting, though we don't necessarily honor it all the time. One of the biggest, I did say this in my talk, but one of the biggest things that inspired me was the works of Japanese photographers of Provoke. And if anyone knows their kind of images, is I always understand them as like an emotional images. I always saw them as if the West was thinking photography as purely documentation, as purely as this is an image of this. I always understood the Japanese as using their street photography as images that are about all the things that existed around this exact moment. The kind of punctum of it all, I guess we could say, if we're doing our school term. But I think I was obsessed with how can I create images that are not purely documentation, but exist in this kind of, I don't know, the space where spirit exists. I think in my artist talk I have this moment where it says the pause between the clap. It's the space that isn't necessarily known, but it's felt. It's part of the process to get there. And I think it's important to kind of reference both reality as, again, referencing the Crossroads, you have to have both this like physical and the space of spirit. You have to have that space in between. You have to have all that kind of airy in between. And so I try to use all these different types of mediums, all these different types of, black and white plus color. I try to use, Polaroids plus burning plus digital plus film. I combine everything, but to me, it's not about the materiality of itself. It's about the kind of whatever tool we can use to get to this emotional sense space. Yeah.
As you're coming to the end of your UC San Diego journey, would you be interested in sharing with us thoughts about how you were when you arrived?
Yeah.
And what has shaped your work during that period? How do you want to take that?
It's been a process. If anyone knows, my advisor, does anyone know the photographer Paul Sapuya? If anyone who does, he's my advisor down there. And I went to study under him, and I came in, and I showed him all these photographic works from the last 10 years of my life. And I was like, I really want to make this into this thing in this book. And he's like, get rid of it all, like let's start anew. And then I started doing sculpture, and I started doing performance, and I started doing video works. He's like, I don't know about all that. But, I came in my first year, I was actually really frustrated with what image making couldn't do. And I think that there's photographers that get there, but I always saw my photographic practice as something that's documenting my interactions with spirit. It's like, here is the moment when like God appeared. Here's this moment when the flash invigorated, Mammy Wanta was present, but it was always this was. And I was so interested in thinking about like my mother's lineage of creating like actual ceremonies, creating spaces where people are going and praying and actually experiencing this like divination. And I was just like, well, I want to do that. And so my second year, I started with doing a sculpture of this light installation where I'll just kind of briefly describe it. There's like a giant disco ball, like a yay big disco ball in a giant black room. It rotates counterclockwise. And these beats, there's a giant subwoofer in the ceiling, and every time you hear this heartbeat, this 808 going boom, the lights flash, and all the smoke in the room just hits at once, and then it goes back to darkness. And people would just go in there, and they would, you'd think that this heavy music would like scare people, but people would go in there and actually just move with the light counterclockwise in the room. They would go and sit there and meditate. They'd go sit there and nap. They'd go sit there and dream. And I was like, that's the thing I want to experience. And so then moving towards what I'm doing towards my thesis work, I went total rejection of that again. And I was just thinking this kind of political moment that we're in, and I was just like, well, I wanted to press against this idea that, representation is a way towards freedom. You know, it's like if we show enough black people in really expensive dresses, it's like where we found the liberatory act. It's like, you know, no shade. But I was like, how can we actually envision like a liberatory act via, you know, artworks? And so, you know, the very gist of it is back in 2020, I remembered, you know, early on in my kind of trans becoming story, I'd always wear this black dress and I'd always go to the protests. And I remember this like force speaking through me, and I was like, there was this woman who I didn't have the name for at the time. And as I was marching through the streets, and I was a big organizer back in Lincoln, Nebraska, and you know, I'd say the names of these women who were killed by the state, these black women who were killed by the state, and I would always be like, this isn't my voice propelling me right now. There's someone else there kind of guiding me. And fast forward to just the last 6 months or the last year, my mother, you know, had a pretty deep practice of channeling spirit, of channeling God, and so did my great-grandmother. And I started kind of doing a channeling practice, and I started speaking to this woman who I felt moving through me, and she had the name of Anarkata. And, well, she didn't give me her name. She just gave me her presence, what her reasoning is for being there. She kind of gave me her manifesto in a sense. And I took all that and I added, and I was thinking of this beautiful manifesto written by this black anarchist queer group that I follow called the Afrofuturist Abolitionists of the Americas. They have this beautiful statement called Anarkata, which is pretty much rooted in this ideology that the West is going to die, and black people's mission isn't necessarily to destroy it, it is we have to outlive it, just as indigenous people always had. And that we have to do communal acts of caring, but also help do the little acts of sabotage we can to help transition or move along this kind of force. And so I started embodying her to do these kind of acts, as well as I started channeling this being called a masquerade, which if anyone knows kind of like, if anyone sees like, you know, I'm trying to think of references. If anyone knows like West African masquerade suits, if anyone's seen like in New Orleans for Mardi Gras, like the Mardi Gras Indians, those are like reference to Mardi Gras, to masquerade suits. So I created a masquerade suit made of sequin and tinsel that's referential to my Flash of Spirit series. And in them, they do these direct actions against the state using the kind of symbology of the cross light of the kind of bullets, or I call them the cross of light with a dark hole in the center. They're very referential to bullet holes. And so the masquerade and Anarkata kind of use these visual tools I've been creating for the last 10 years as weapons and arsenal to be able to do action. So I bought a I bought a LA Sheriff's Department police cruiser that was decommissioned, and I'm in the process of creating a 20-minute film of the masquerade destroying this police car. I have the masquerade shooting Kalashnikov AK-47, which is a tool or a weapon used by the global South to fight against Western imperialism. But I have all these really violent acts done by these beings mixed with these moments of Anarkata, just walking along a beach, being, as I'm channeling her, saying, hey, I'm here as an act of love. The Crossroads is a thing. I'm coming from this space of ancestor to remind you that we can get to this other side. You have to act, and I'm here to hold you as you do these actions. And so that's kind of what my thesis has been transitioning into. Huh.
Cool answer.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So when you photograph, do you feel like there is a specific spirit that you're channeling?
It's been so different over the years. Again, it's been 13 years of doing this work, and I think with every image I've at least chosen within this body of work, I wouldn't necessarily there's a specific spirit happening, but there's this certain moment where, I think of that line, oh, who was it? I think it was Robert Adams said this quote of a great photographer only gets 10 images a year or something like that. Or was it Robert, or it might have been Angela Adams, okay. And I just think of he said that in context of spirit gives you those photos. You can't plan to make those photos. They just it's moments that just happen. And I think so many of the photos that have in this wall, I never went out I'm going to go do a shoot and make this exact thing. It always is something that just kind of birthed from the moment of truly being present with people I love, or I remember when I first burned, this was the first time I ever burned a Polaroid, and I was just sitting, I was literally burning, I started lighting my altar, and I was just praying for a moment, and I just went outside my studio and I started burning a hole in like this image, which everyone loved this original image. Like, this needs to be burned right now. Something is calling me to do that. And so I think a lot of the images have just come out of like whatever energy said I need to come through in this moment, I just gave it the space to come through and do its thing. Yeah. Yeah.
What's a question that you wish people would ask or find themselves asking when they look at your art or engage with you?
It's a good one. It's a painful question. It's like, I think it would be like one of those questions that's like really hard to answer that makes me start re-questioning like why the hell am I even doing some certain things in the first place. I had Paul came in and he's like, why do you do black and white? And I was just like, Paul, chill. But, then I was able to like come around and be like, well, yeah, I'm thinking of the post-war Japanese photographers. I'm also thinking of the ideas of Afro-pessimism and the ideas of being in the wake and what does it mean for, I honestly see black and white as a form of wake work and the fact of the kind of like voids that exist in the blacks, that I use so much present in my work. Also the timelessness and not able to escape that. I think of this kind of stuck in a moment in time. I also kind of refer, so like I had to form a language because of questions that like really pissed me off at first when they were first given to me. But I mean, yeah. Do you have a question that you think would like really just grind my gears? I would love it, because I would.
This has made me think of Roland Barthes' Empire of Signs. And outside of him as a person, I do think that, yeah, I will say that. Outside of his work, I do hold that book special. I've looked at it analytically and written about it for a thesis.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing a lot of signs, signifier. I also do own a copy of this piece, which is one of my favorites. And I'm seeing a lot of how you're putting so much of yourself, your ancestors' work, your mother's work, your grandmother's work, your father's work through these pieces. Yeah. And then there are like the Crossroads, there's boundaries to it, but it's very it dissipates,
Yeah.
Like you were saying before the other questions, like hey, why not both, sort of? Why not combining and then making something new from that? And we don't know how it will honor our spirit, but it means these certain things you can tell when you're looking at it.
I don't have an answer to that, well, but I that fits. Thank you. Yeah.
This is gonna sound formal and I
No, give it to me.
I'm really curious about scale, because scale has so much to do with how, like, we have a relationship with the piece, like how we physically and psychologically feel with it. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts and just how you came about, hearing the 4 directions was cool to hear. But I'm interested in hearing the rest of, like, how did this version of the show come into being, including scale and arrangement?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot of spectacle as I've been putting together my thesis itself, and just like, I'm just drawing a cop car, and so it has to be projected big, like there's a spectacality to it. But then when you go and interact with Enarcata's piece, you go into this fabric booth, and I won't call it a confessional, but it kind of feels like in a similar sense. You go into this little space and then you listen to this kind of prayer happening. But both to me have a similar scale to me in what they are, but they're like very different in like the actual literal physical scale of them. So when I was thinking of putting this show together, I think a lot of it does come with the grandiousness of like, I think certain things need to, I want a giant photo of Kupo because I want to honor who Kupo was. I want a giant image of violence because I want to honor what violence is. And I also want to have an image that started this entire practice that's referencing, my mother's teacher on an altar, and that's something that's intimate and small and needs to be held. There's certain moments that actually get tied because, as much as I love photography, I'm like one of those photographers that just is like, I don't care, literally with everything. It's like, oh, I don't need to shoot this medium format. I'll use a APS-C, little tiny Panasonic Lumix to create half of this work and then blow it up to 40 inches. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes the flashes of spirits have gotten stuck at 2436 because of those decisions. But I think that they need to be big. I want to create portals that people feel like they can walk through. And so I think a lot of it ends up being like, how can I push the kind of, how can I create a space that kind of does what I believe my second year show did of people actively feeling spirit? How can I create works in a certain scale where people are interacting with it that also feels like a spiritual intervention or a spiritual kind of interaction, And these are kind of the sizes that I ended up for this. And I could see the same images being different sizes for a different context, for a different space, depending on the direction of the gallery itself, I think it changes pretty often. But it's something I'm definitely thinking of, that Paul also walked into my studio and said why 3 years ago. So, yeah, thank you. Any last questions?
Great, well, thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you.